Dalen here. It's that time again. This is video 4 where we build a booknook diorama together. In this video, I'm going to finish the walls, the floor, the door, and the windows, and get us ready for our big move-in. Now, these techniques can be used for all sorts of different nooks, dioramas, scale modeling, and terrain building for RPG. It's going to feel like a lot. I think there are like 5 layers to the painting process. Be sure to keep me honest in the comments. But it's fairly forgiving. There's a lot of room for do and redo, and it leads to some really great results. But before we get started, this is the first video where we have some Patreon shoutouts. I'd like to send a big thanks to W, you know who you are, and Don C, you are the OG inspiration investors. Thank you. You make this possible. I'd also like to give a special shout out and an apology to Tila P. You joined as a patron 2 years ago before I had ever posted anything to my page. And you understandably left when I let the page completely languish. You took a chance on me and I let you down. And for that, I am truly sorry. A lot's changed in my life since then. I am more committed now than ever to really build a community around this channel in all sorts of ways, not just through Patreon, but really by working hard to share my love of world building and storytelling with all of you through the magic of making all sorts of crazy and random things. So, speaking of making crazy and random things, let's just bust out the paint. I'm using a mixture of half water and half some sort of acrylic medium. It could be a matte medium, it could be a gloss medium or varnish. Basically a ratio 50-50 to give everything a surface coat to seal all of the pores, basically to seal the grain. Now, this is going to feel a little weird because we're not really staining the wood eventually. We're just going to use the wood as texture and form, and we're really going to paint our finishes on top of these materials. Seems a little weird, but it works out. The next step is to create a middle value for all of our surfaces. We want to sort of start to establish the color and overall tonality and lights and darks in the project. Now I'm using very inexpensive craft paints. I'm using this espresso brown and green. And the reason I'm using green is because there is a lot of red in this particular brown. And I want to knock that back a little bit. And so green being the complement of red, it helps dial that back a little bit. You can see I'm being extremely messy. You can be more careful. I'm being kind of sloppy here. It's just to show you, we don't really need to be all that careful at this particular stage of our painting process. Everything wood gets this sort of wood value, and then I'm going to create kind of this weird creamy color and just kind of flood in that over all of the plaster surfaces. And this is really also helping to further seal the surface and provide a base layer. It's actually harder, in my opinion, to paint on these raw surfaces when they're just open wood. It sucks up the paint and it's very hard to do different things. The next step, for those of you who are keeping count, is to go in and take a very, very transparent wash and pick out certain boards to make them darker, to provide some variation. I don't think this is too early to do this because as we move forward, it'll continue to blend in as we add additional layers, but we're starting to really now create variation and shading in our different pieces and parts. So you can see here, I'm kind of just picking out an edge. I'm being a little bit more cautious here, a little careful in my blending and my painting. It's not hypercritical though, more paint's gonna come. And again, this is kind of, use cheap brushes is kind of what you get, but I've got wet paint on it, so the painting must go on, the show must go on. So Continuing on to kind of blend this out before the paint dries. And a little bit of electrical tape. These are inexpensive brushes, but I destroy them anyway, so I might as well continue to work them until they're completely ruined. The idea here again, though, is really just to begin to define lights and darks, shadows, and really help pop certain edges. This is a very, very transparent wash of the brown. Still not hyper careful with this. You can see though it's kind of adding more visual interest to certain areas, and in some cases some of these beams start to feel like they're all blending together, and I want to just catch that edge on it just to provide a little bit more contrast. I always say visual interest. Visual interest is a word that I use all of the time, but that's really what we're trying to do, is create more interesting variations. Now, the next thing is we're going to do some scumbling. I love the word scumble. I don't know why. Scumble's a fun word, but basically I'm just with a little bit more opaque paint, kind of in this creamy color. I'm really just sort of starting to drag in and fill and cover those really messy parts that I created. Now in this next part, I would normally use these Liquitex colors because they're extremely transparent, but I want to just keep using these really inexpensive craft paints. I don't want you to have to go buy expensive paints, and these things are under $2 a bottle, sometimes 99 cents a bottle. So let's just see how far we can push craft paint. I think you'll see at the end that we can get some pretty stellar results with very, very inexpensive paints. This is really, really transparent. So it's just a touch of color. I'm watering everything down. Again, I'm using medium to make sure that the paints actually have a little bit of medium in them so they don't just all kind of rub off. And I'm just gonna slather the heck out of the diorama, the Nook, with this wash. It looks kind of horrendous. You'll see in a minute it looks really horrendous. But the idea here is we want to get this dark color, this dark wash into all the nooks and crannies. This is kind of our dirt and our grime and our deepest shadows. And we're just gonna flood it in. And there we go. We're just gonna go for it. Now, you want to spritz it with water every once in a while just to keep it flowing, make sure it doesn't dry out. We want to keep it fluid, and we do want to kind of blend a little bit so we're not getting a lot of brush strokes and hard edges. As we move through the painting process, we'll become more and more careful. This is clearly not a careful phase, but I do want things smooth. Here I'm using the brush to lift back some of that on some of the lighter materials, and then make sure that I'm picking up areas that have really pooled. But I do want to kind of selectively, carefully pool things into nooks and crannies. But you can see everything looks like there's a wash over it, not brush strokes. It looks like just sort of mud and grime and grunge over it. And I'm letting it run into the cracks. And the running kind of also helps blend things. And I'm absorbing areas where it's pooled and it's going to be too dark. At this point, you look at it and you go, oh dear God, what have I done? Like, you really will look at this and go, I've completely ruined my project. But you haven't. Now we start to fix things. We're going to start dry brushing. So here we've got kind of where we're going, this white area over here, and then sort of those original beige areas, which was the result of the washing. We scumbled a couple steps ago. We're going to do a little bit more dry brushing now. Dry brushing, this is a kind of between scumbling and dry brushing. Scumbling is more like dragging opaque paint. Dry brushing is really more like it sounds, just lightly dusting and dry brushing. This is kind of in between. But the one thing I want to do is I want to mask off the wood, because in dry brushing, there's going to be a lot of flicking and whipping that brush around. So I want to make sure I don't have to worry too much about the wood. Again, we're becoming more careful in our painting application as we move along. I'm going to start with a slightly creamy color. The difference between these two colors is really negligible. One's white and one is sort of this cream color, but I'm gonna brush in from the tape. This is a lot like stenciling. If you've done any stenciling, we're gonna move in from the edges because we don't wanna catch anything up underneath the tape. I actually do, and we'll have to fix it, but I'm just kind of working the brush in. It's a kind of a soft medium brush that's got a rounded tip, much like a makeup brush. There are dry brush brushes specifically. You can use makeup brushes, anything that you can, the brushes that tend to work for this technique tend to not have hard edges to them because we want to really have a nice soft feathered finish. So here we've got kind of that initial lighter color, and it's starting to really cover a lot of that grungy nastiness. But I want to now, this Nook isn't going to be like a disaster zone. Like, it's not going to be a total ruin. It's going to be lived in. So I want to brighten it up a little bit and have a little bit more freshness to it. But I don't want it to be perfect. And so I'm going to come back in with white, and I'm mixing right over the cream color. And I've actually got a little bit of that cream color left in the bowl. Now in this area, you can see like it's starting to drag the paint, and I'm starting to get some weird lack of coverage. So if it starts to feel like it's behaving badly, let it dry and then go back in and do your final dry brushing. You can see there's a little bit, I caught a little bit of that edge underneath the tape, but that's fine. Okay, so here are all of the panels that are dry brushed. I didn't want to force you to watch me tape everything and dry brush everything. Now it's looking good, but it's still looking pretty crusty. We still need to do a lot of cleanup on the wood. So that's the next step. What I'm going to do here is all of these inside edges, I've got a more opaque brown wash. And this is going to allow me to cover up all of those little puddles and bleeding, and not bleeding, like I didn't cut myself, thankfully, knock on wood, on this project for a change. But all of those areas, and really reinforce those edges. At this point, I'm going to add a hinges to the windows, and I just used these toothpicks. These are little decorative toothpicks, and I snipped the ends off because they kind of look like hinges and they kind of feel like they're the right size. And so I'm just going to glue these in because we're getting to the point where we're starting to finish the wood, and I don't want to get too far along and not have them blend in. So a little bit of PVA, a little bit of craft glue, tacky glue, and I'm just gluing in the ends of these. You could use a regular old toothpick and just run a little, maybe with an X-Acto knife, run a couple little lines in for the edges of the hinges. These just happen to be kicking around. Always be looking for these kinds of things at craft stores when you're in there. Okay, now it starts to get interesting. We've cleaned up all of the edges of the wood, and now we want to really go back in and with a much warmer and brighter and lighter brown, kind of this, I think this was called honeycomb, really pick out and dry brush edges and the grain. In this case, I am using a nice flat brush, and I'm just laying it flat and dragging it. It's fairly dry brush, but dragging that in to really pick up the grain. You can see like on the left side of that window, it really looks like it has sort of this rough sawn effect. Now, don't hate me. We're gonna do one more wash, and this is actually the final layer for the paint. So for those of you who are keeping track, I don't know how many layers of paint we got, but that's our final layer. Now we're going to actually use some of this craft scrap assortment rods and tubes and sheets of polystyrene to create hinges for the door. This was way more than it needs to be. You could create these with some craft board, some tag board, some poster board, something thick. Cut these out, couple pieces of toothpick for the hinges. It really does not need to be this elaborate. This kind of got a little crazy. I took a file though to kind of give some edges, so it has sort of a rough hammered look, rough forged look. And then these are some inexpensive craft metallic paints. For the latch, turns out doorknobs and handles aren't anything that were invented back in ye olden days. I want to say sometime in the 1800s is when the first patent for an actual doorknob with a latch was patented. And so basically door latches and closure devices were very, very simple. They were some sort of a, sort of a deadbolty thing. Sometimes it was just string or rope that was holding together, but very, very simple. So using some little bits and scraps of balsa wood and a toothpick, I created a little sliding latch for the door. And that is the door done. I used some pins for the rivets. For the handles on the window, I'm going to use these jewelry findings. Again, craft stores, man, when you are out and about and you're looking through craft stores, these little jewelry findings, these little glass beads are really awesome for different things. And so a little bit of metallic paint on the hinges, bronze and sort of a deep dark bronze, and that is the window. Now the window needs some glazing. I'm using some inexpensive plastic that you can get, again, at the craft store that is used for picture framing. That's a glass substitute. And I'm going to use a paint pen to draw some leading. You can use any paint pen, but I think that what we want is opaque, and we want something that's going to leave a little bit of a raised surface. These are also going to stick very well to the plastic because it's an enamel oil-based paint. And it's also the extra fine one. I started with a couple 3 layers as I was drawing it, but as time went on and the paint started to really flow, sometimes too much out of the paint pen, as it often does, I only really needed to use a swipe. You want to make sure that your ruler is elevated so you don't get any bleeding underneath the actual ruler. And that could be with you could actually just tape a piece of paper, a couple layers of like a thick masking tape to raise that surface up. And that is our leading. Okay, now what we need to do next is add a little bit of interest to this because this is a little dull. So I want to use some gloss medium, and I'm going to stick with the craft paints, although I think ideally there are some paints out there that are for faux glass painting where they're transparent. I think those would work better, but I really wanted to keep it in not having to go out and buy a bunch of different paints. So I'm mixing a lot of gel with just the tiniest bit of paint, and I think I still had too much paint. I'm just blobbing it on the reverse side in as random a way as possible. And then here is some red, and I'm using muted colors. You can use vibrant colors if you want, and you want to have something a little bit more with a little bit more vibrancy. But I think that in ye olden times, the colors that were available tended to be a bit more, just a tiny bit more muted. Once that's all dry, the last thing I'm going to do is just dab some gel medium, straight gel medium across the window so that it provides some variation and variety to the glass. And that is it. This is what the results are. Now, I hope you liked this. I hope you found this interesting and exciting and helpful, and it inspires you to go out and do this. Go out and make your own Nook. The next step is going to be to actually furnish the interior, and then we'll move on to lighting, and then really wrap up the exterior of the case and bring it all home. Be sure to like, subscribe, ask questions, post comments. I do try to respond to every comment. All of these things help support the channel, help feed the algorithm, help grow our little cabal here. If you want to take a more active role in joining the creative cabal, head over to Patreon, check out my Patreon page, visit me on Instagram, all of those great things. I'm off to go build some mini furniture for our book Nook, so we will see you again on another random making encounter. Until then, happy making.